Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live stream. So, my name is Johannes, and we are talking today about Serverpod. And Serverpod is basically a backend solution that we can use for integrating into our Flutter apps and that we can use using Flutter. And yeah, this is basically the missing server for Flutter. And today we have also like a special guest with us. It's nothing less than the founder of Serverpod himself, Victor. Welcome to this live stream. Yeah, hello.
Hey,
Now you see you.
thanks for having me.
Yes,
Good.
it's great to be that you are here. Let's directly jump into it. So before we start, I want to mention to everyone you can ask your questions directly in the chat. So we have a Q&A session after the live stream. And for this, just make sure to write all your questions right now inside or during the live stream. And at the end of the live stream, we are answering all of these questions. So whenever you have a question, write it in the chat. Okay, all right. And we start right now, first of all, with 4 questions. And after these 4 questions, there will be a demo where Victor shows us more about Serverpod, how to use it, and after this, we have then the Q&A session. Okay, all right, Victor. So the first question is, what inspired you to create Serverpod in the first place?
So that's a great question. I used to run another startup before Serverpod, and I at that point it was kind of hard to write your backend with Dart. I obviously built our app with Flutter, and I really missed having a Dart backend. So I started out writing it in Python, and then I, just at some point, said, "Yeah, I don't want to deal with this anymore." So I rewrote everything in Dart, and I took a lot of learnings from that. And I figured when that startup failed, there's probably more developers like me who really wants to build a backend in Dart, just because it's nice to be able to use, the same computer language throughout your stack. Also have the benefits of being able to share code between your backend and the front end, which actually can be pretty huge for some applications. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that was the inspiration. It was born out of my own need, if you will.
Yeah, from my side, I always thought as well, like, why is there not a solution for Flutter that you can easily use? And you created it. That's really great. Okay, all right. So what is then that sets Serverpod apart from other backend solutions? What are the strengths of Serverpod?
Yeah, so we have quite a few innovations in Serverpod. I'm going to show a few of them in the demo, but first and foremost, being able to use Dart, as I mentioned, is huge and a time saver. Then we built Serverpod to make your whole sort of backend communication seamless. So you just add methods to your server. You add them to your server. Serverpod will analyze your server code and will replicate the same methods that you add on your server in your client or in your app. So when you call that method, it's like calling a local method in the app. So the whole sort of layer in between is just seamless. Behind the scenes, we build a REST API for you, handle all the serialization, and build the whole API. So there's like no real magic happening there in that sense. It's just a very nice way to use it. We also made it work with exceptions. So you can have an exception that you throw on the server and then you catch it on the client, which is pretty cool for error handling server side. And we also made it work with streams. So you can, instead of returning a value, you can return a stream and then you can return multiple values. So that's a very, very convenient way to do real-time communication.
Yes, definitely. Okay, all right. That are already some things that set apart, but probably we will see it more during the demo, what makes Serverpod so great. Yeah, we also saw there's like a new solution, Serverpod Mini. So what is the difference between Serverpod Mini and Serverpod?
Right.
Can you tell more
So
about
so we built Serverpod with lots of bells and whistles. It comes with an ORM. That means that you can have automatic mappings to a database, and we have support for database relations, database migrations. It's all type safe, Dart first. You work with Dart types. That was a lot of work. It's probably over a year's work building that, and to do it like in a really good way. I would say maybe we do the tricky part or the hard part so other developers can do the fun parts. And there are a few other features that are also using the database. For instance, you can schedule calls sometime in the future. We call those future calls. So say you have a user who signs up, you can remind them 1 week from now, you just make a future call, and that goes through the database. But there are some developers that just want something fast and quick. So we have sort of a stripped down version of Serverpod that we call Mini, Serverpod Mini, that doesn't have the database. So that we stripped out the features that require the database. So you can just run it as a server. It's very simple, lightweight. So that is Mini. And when you create a project, you just add a --mini flag. That's what I'm going to demo today. But you can, at any point, you can upgrade your Serverpod Mini if you need that database, or you need future calls, or you need improved logging, all those things that uses the database. You can just add them on at the latest stage too. That's not a problem.
Okay, great. I got here like a question inside, and I think we already answered right now, because I think it matches also with the previous question a bit. So if you can see, that's really small maybe. There's one question: why not to use Firebase? What are the benefits of using basically Serverpod over Firebase?
Right. So I like to think there are a few things that we do much better than Firebase. If you do anything with real-time communication, doing that through Firestore would be very expensive, very fast. Whereas in Serverpod, you can just do that much of that real-time communication just within the server. You never have to hit the database. When you work on the server side, the most expensive part is really writing and reading from your database. That's more expensive than anything else you do. And the hardest part to scale up. So Serverpod, you can do a lot of that work in the server instead of in the database. It's easy to scale up the server, so you can just add more of them very easily. Whereas the database is a little bit more expensive and sort of heavier to scale up. So that's one thing. Another big thing is that you can host Serverpod anywhere. So you can host it not only at Google, which for some applications is crucial. We have apps being built on Serverpod, one that is used by NHS for surgeons to take notes during operations. And in Europe, you're not allowed to save that kind of data in the cloud, like in the US, for instance, if you're in Europe. So for those kind of applications, it's also crucial that they own their data. You can do that with Serverpod. You also have the option to host it anywhere. We're building a Serverpod cloud solution where you can deploy to our cloud very, very easily. We just zero configuration and just basically 1 or 2 lines on the command prompt and you're done. But you can also choose to host it in your basement, on AWS, Google Cloud, wherever is convenient or suits your needs. So that's a huge one as well. Also, it's some feedback we hear from Firebase users is that as your application grows, both becomes more expensive to host it, but it's also trickier to have a clean, good architecture as the app grows over time. It may be hard to maintain compatibility with all the versions of apps and stuff like that. And that's something we do much better with Serverpod as well.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Then let's go to the next question that is maybe also really important for many people who want to start out. Is Serverpod free, or what are the different packages that you offer?
Yeah, Serverpod is free. It's free as in beer, but it's also free as in speech. So it's open source. You can basically fork it, use it, host it anywhere. So where we are going to I mean, we're building a company around Serverpod, and what we are going to charge for is the Serverpod cloud solution. But that's something you would have to pay anyway if you go to Google Cloud or AWS or Azure or any of the other cloud providers. You can still host Serverpod like on the server in your basement, and then it's all free, I guess.
Okay, that's great. Great to hear that. All right. Yeah, we can directly jump into the demo itself. So you can share your screen and can show us more about Serverpod, what makes it special, and how to get started maybe with Serverpod and how to use it.
Right. Yeah, let's go.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, so let me just get the mouse pointer on the right screen. So the first thing I was thinking we could do is just start a new project from scratch. And we're going to do Serverpod Create, and why not Hey Flutter? And we make it a mini project. We just pass in the mini flag. And this will create a project for us. In a second there, you can go into Hey Flutter and open this up in VS Code. Right, so you can see here we have a project, but it has 3 different directories, so 3 Dart packages. So first we have the Hey Flutter server, which where we have all our server code stuff. Then we have a client. This is where the generated code for the client lives, but we also have a Flutter app that is created for us. That it's the Flutter app will import the client. So typically you will never really need to touch the client, but you work in your Flutter app. The reason we put them in a separate package is that sometimes you have an existing Flutter app and then you can just import a client, or sometimes maybe you're building multiple apps that use the same server, or maybe you're building something that's not a Flutter app. It could be another Dart application, maybe a CLI tool or something. So that gives you that flexibility. So we'll start by looking in the server here. And we have a library folder. There's basically server.dart. That's just the starting point for the server. And then we have basically 2 important folders. The first one is our endpoints folder. Here we place endpoints that are like the connection points to the server. And in the endpoints, we can place methods that we can call from our Flutter app. And in the models, we place model files that are basically classes that we can pass to and from the server or add to our database. So if we start looking at the endpoint to see what this looks like, you can see there's it comes with an example endpoint here. We can there's a lot of comments to get you started and understand how things work, but it's actually pretty simple. You just create a class. We have here an example endpoint class, and it will extend an endpoint. And then we just add a method here. There are a few rules for the methods that you add for Serverpod to be able to recognize these, and that they need to return a future, and that future need to be typed. So here we're returning a future string. And then the first parameter needs to be a session object. The session object is a little bit like the build context in Flutter. So it has information about the call you're making and stuff like that. It gives you access to the database. If you use the full version of Serverpod, it gives you access to caching, communication between servers through PubSub, things like that. So Serverpod is like from the ground up built to be very scalable. So we do have support for caching, PubSub, basically all those core features that you need. So in this example, we take a string that we call name, and then we just return hello name. So let's jump to the Flutter side of this and see what this looks like on the client side. And here we have just a main Dart file. Serverpod comes with a simple example. First, we need to create a client object. And that's basically how we connect to the server. This client object is generated by Serverpod, so we never have to build this ourselves. And you can optionally attach a connectivity monitor, which is recommended. It works without it, but it's will be better for when you do real-time communication. It will see if you're connected to the internet and stuff like that. Next, it has a simple homepage. Maybe I'll just run this app and we can have a look what it looks like. It's a very simple Hello World app where you can send that message to the server. So this might take a second. It's not us, it's Flutter or Xcode. All right, there we go. So basically it just has a field where you can enter your name. So it can be Johannes here. Send to server. Oops. Yep, we get an error because we haven't started the server. That can be a good thing to do. So let's see, just open a terminal here. We go into the Hey Flutter server and do a Dart bin main Dart. That's the sort of main file for the server that we're starting. All right, it's running. Let's see if this works better now. Then we get a response from the server instead. So the only thing this app does, it will basically send a message to the server and either show the response or show the errors if something goes wrong. So let's have a look at that method that does that call in our app. If I go here, let's see, this is the call hello method. So when we press that button, we just call this method, call hello, and we can see what that does. We will use the client object that we created at the top of our app, and then we have the example endpoint, and on the endpoint we have the hello method, and then we just pass in the string from that text field, and we await the result, and the result will be hello, whatever string we pass in. And we have it in the try catch, so if it throws an exception, we'll just set an error message here. So that's the whole call. We can try to make something a little bit more fun out of this. So I'm going to add another method here. And in the latest version of Serverpod, we added a new real-time interface. So I'm going to show how that works. Instead of returning a future, we can return a stream instead. So say a stream of integers, and we can call it countdown. And we're going to make the, oops, needs to take a session object. And we make it async star. So the async star will, it's like async, but it returns the stream. So that means that we can return multiple values basically through the yield keyword. So we can make a for loop here for I equals 10 and it's larger than 0, and then we just do a countdown like that. And before we do that, we wait a second between each value we return. We can do that by awaiting a future. That's just delayed future, and it needs a duration. So we set that to 1 second, like so. And we can steal that value like that. And now we created a method that basically counts down from 10 to 1. It will yield 1 value per second. To try this out in our app, we need to first run Serverpod generate. And we do this in the server directory or the server package. So that will now add this countdown method to our client. So if we go to our app instead here, and we can extend the hello method. So after we get the result, we can just get that stream instead. So final, we can call it countdown stream maybe. And we have from our client, we can get to the example endpoint, and then we have the countdown method here. So that's the method we just added to our server. So this is how easy they get over to your client, and you can use them immediately. And then we can just do a wait for, to wait for the values. Count, is it work count? Countdown stream, and then we can set the result message to count maybe. See if this works. We may need an equals there. And yes, this needs to be in a set state for this to work. All right. Let's see if this worked. So if we jump into here and say Victor this time, send it to server. All right. Need to start that server again. So there we have a countdown. So we're actually passing these messages from the server to our app. And basically that's the basis for doing real-time communication. You just connect to a stream, and then we also have utilities in the server for passing the messages internally in the server or between servers. So if you make a chat app, you just make a stream that you listen to when you post messages internally in the server, and you can listen to that stream in many different places to pass messages on. There's one more thing that I would love to show, and that's a feature I think is pretty neat, and that's how you can handle errors with Serverpod. So if we jump back to the server here, let's look at the model. So Serverpod comes with the example project comes with just an example class. This is basically how these model files look. We define a class in a YAML file and then the fields. So here we have an example, and it has a name, string, and a data that's an integer. And that will, when we run Serverpod generate, this will create a class for us. But we cannot just create classes as models. You can also connect these to the database. But we can also create exceptions. So we can do like a my exception, maybe. Oops. And instead of having the class keyword, we make it an exception. And in Dart, exceptions are really just classes, so you can add any type of fields to it as well, which can be very good for error handling. So we can have fields. We'll add a field that's called maybe description, and we make that a string. So you can see we get some error messages here. So we have like full type checking of the YAML files that you write with Serverpod and syntax coloring, and that's happening through our VS Code extension. So if you work with Serverpod, it's a really good idea to install that as well. It will give you a lot of help while writing your YAML files. All right, so when we've done that, we can just run Serverpod generate again, and that will generate this exception for us. So say we go to our example endpoint here. Maybe we want to do some type validation. So we can say if the string we pass in here, name, is Victor, then we throw an exception because that's not a name we want anyone else but me to use. So we can do my exception and say, hey, this name is not okay. And then we just run the server. And since we modified the code, we'll need to restart our Flutter app. And let's see here. So if I say Johannes, we should get a hello Johannes. And if I say Victor, I get that exception instead. And yes, the description you get is basically the toString method of the exception will give you a YAML a JSON representation of that object. So you can also just catch that my exception on the server or in your Flutter app if you want. So those were the things I figured could be pretty cool to show today. But obviously, you can create any sort of models that you pass to and from the model to and from the server. You can connect your models to the database with our ORM. It's really a full-fledged backend solution now. We are actually currently 7 people working full-time on Serverpod, so we're moving forward really, really fast. So that was my demo.
All right, great. Yeah, we look further also into Serverpod and some more questions, so maybe you can show a bit more later. But
Yeah,
first
of course.
Let's go back to our slides, and I think we just continue with some questions from the community.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this question is one which is good maybe. Is Serverpod good for authentication, CRUD operation, just basic app, or just use Firebase or Supabase, I guess?
Yeah, we have support for authentication. CRUD things, super easy with Serverpod. So we have support for social sign-ins. And what is really cool, if you use sign-in with Google, will actually authenticate your users on the server side as well, which is actually pretty tricky to do, which means you can use all Google's server-side APIs on the behalf of that user. So you can get access to the calendars, all those things just work, and they work seamlessly with Google's APIs. And they have a full APIs for Dart as well. So yeah, that definitely works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then there's another question. Let's maybe move it a bit up. So if I learn Serverpod for backend instead of Node.js, Java Spring, how effective it will be my career?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we are pretty small right now, but there are over 1,000 apps built with Serverpod to date, or being built. So and we're growing really fast. So I think in a year there will there are a few job opportunities right now for Serverpod, but if you're starting a project as a startup or from scratch, it's a great place to start because it will save you so much time if you are a Flutter developer, being able to use like your Flutter skills on the back end as well, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. There's another question. Can you build a complete real-time chat app with user accounts now, or make a full tutorial if possible? It will make it more encouraging for beginners.
So
yeah.
We actually have a chat module that you can just plug in to get the chat up and running. So Serverpod is built around a modular structure. So module in Serverpod is both server code, it's client code, Flutter code, and database schemas, which is pretty neat. So you can just plug in the chat module, you get all those tables required to handle the chat and store them. It works with authentication, users, and you even have like the Flutter code to show the chat. So we're looking into doing a tutorial for that, but it's there's some parts in the documentation about how you do it right now.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's where we also come to the documentation. Before that, yeah, let's have some more questions. So what's your advice for developers just starting out with Serverpod?
I think a great place to start is we made a few videos that show we build a little bit more advanced real-time communication app that we call Pixorama, which is basically like our place, if you've seen that, where you can draw. It's a multi-user drawing program, basically. And that's less than a page of code, but it shows you exactly how to do the real-time communication. Yeah, it's on our YouTube channel. We also have a few getting started guides. Both one is building a to-do app with database, and yeah, basically half an hour getting started explaining how you do the CRUD operations, how you do all those things. But definitely something we're working on, bringing more tutorials to the world. It's one of our top priorities.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, maybe we can also talk a bit about the documentation of Serverpod at this
Yeah.
point. So let's see, Serverpod documentation, or do you want to share from your side and tell a bit?
You're welcome to. It's docs.serverpod.dev.
Yes. So
Yeah,
here,
you found it there.
yeah. So that
So
documentation, maybe you can tell a bit about it. So
right, so you can see we have a few tutorials to get started, and then the whole bulk of the documentation is really under the reference tab. Or if you expand that, you'll see there's like all the different features are documented in detail here. So it's actually, I think we cover almost everything that is in Serverpod documentation wise. Even how you set up, if you want to do authentication, maybe with custom providers, you can build that with Serverpod, so you're not limited to the one that we provide. You can plug in other ones. It's also detailed documentation for how you host it, and yeah, we try to cover everything there. That being said, we also have a GitHub page with a discussion board and where people ask questions, and we're super active there. Also, a lot of people will answer other users' questions as well, which is really good to see.
yes. Yeah, definitely worth to check out the documentation of Serverpod if you want to know more about it and learn all the
Yeah.
details next to the videos that you have hosted on your YouTube channel. Okay, so another question is, how do you envision Serverpod's role in the future of full stack Flutter development? What is
Right.
the future of Serverpod?
My vision is definitely that Serverpod will be the default choice for all Flutter developers. That's where we want to go. And just we're listening to all the feedback we have, and we're adding so many new features with every release. We have, a next release just around the corner. We had the last release with the streams that I just showed just a month ago. So it's really moving on in like a very fast pace. That being said, what we have now, there are, I mean, many man years in there now. We're 7 people working on it, so it's a serious project, and we have, I think, somewhere around 5,000 tests to make sure everything is working. So we're really making sure it's a solid project, and it's definitely production ready. And there's some very serious app already on Serverpod, which is super flattering to see.
Yes, flattering. That's great. Okay. Yeah, so maybe we can also talk about some top new features. So because you are always developing new things,
Yeah.
what are the top new three features for Serverpod or Serverpod Mini?
Yeah, I would say like the streams, that's both Serverpod Mini and Serverpod. it's just such a convenient way. It hides so much of the complexity when doing real-time communication. Otherwise, we handle all that like for you, opening up that WebSocket. We patch everything through the same WebSocket, so it's like very efficient in that way, route it to the right methods for you. And we also handle how you connect to the WebSocket and the sort of life cycle of it. So reconnecting if something goes wrong is very, very easy and efficient. So I think that's a really, really powerful feature that really no one else has at this point. It done in that accessible way. Otherwise, there's also always pretty tricky doing real-time communication because there's so many edge cases. What happens if your internet connection goes down? Will you detect that? You need to handle that yourself, or how do you reconnect to the server? All those things, just really neat. Second new feature, I would say one that is we have in the beta version now. It's actually available in the latest release, but it's behind experimental flag. We're using it internally now to basically eat our own dog food because it's super important that this is done right. But we built a very extensive testing framework for Serverpod. So building integration tests will be very, very easy if you want to test your endpoints. You can set up basically an environment with authentication, stuff like that for every test. And it even you can run all the tests in isolation as well, because it uses transactions and transactions within transactions to handle like the database rollback after you run the test. So it sort of resets the database between the tests and stuff like that. It's was quite a lot of work to get that all top notch, but that's a really powerful feature, I think, especially for big companies that really care about having good test coverage.
Definitely.
That would be very easy.
Really important.
And then, of course, our biggest, I don't know if that's a feature. It's not a feature of the framework, but it's something we've been working on for almost a year now, and that is Serverpod Cloud. And that's basically a new way to deploy your server. So you will be able to just type Serverpod Cloud deploy, and we set up your whole infrastructure with load balancers, database, buckets for uploading files, pub subs. You can communicate with the servers in the cluster, caching. All that will just be in place and work with all the Serverpod APIs out of the box. We already have Terraform scripts, so you can do this, get this infrastructure for Google Cloud or AWS, but it's still, I think most developers really don't want to maintain their own infrastructure because it's a lot of work. Also, there are security concerns. If you haven't got that experience, it's a little bit scary. Making sure you get everything right, but if you take a wrong turn, I mean, it can affect your whole company or your app, or So we're making sure to do that right. An internal beta, so we can run it ourselves, and we hope we have a few people trying it out as well. But hopefully, very soon we will be able to share it with more people, and definitely early next year it will be more widely available for everyone.
Yeah, that was also like here a question: when should we expect the Serverpod Cloud? So
all right.
So it will be
you got the rundown.
next year.
But I'm really excited about that because it's a game changer for any Serverpod user, but also I think we'll be able eventually to run other Dart servers on Serverpod Cloud if you prefer something else.
Yeah. Okay, there are some more questions. That might be also interesting. So some user has the feeling that Serverpod is very complicated compared to Supabase. So he suggests, like, please make it easy as possible as Supabase, and I'm gonna use it like crazy. So what do you think is still, where can you, or like, is Serverpod complicated, or where can you see
Uh,
that he's talking about this.
yeah. So we hear that from some people, but it's usually most of the time it's people who haven't really tried it. Uh, I think it's a little bit maybe more making the documentation. You saw what I did today, and that's like all it takes to set up a Serverpod project and write your endpoints. So it's really not that hard. But we also opted to make, there's like a choice you have always when you make this type of products, is you can dumb them down. We could have maybe just added a Flutter project and the server project, or maybe even had them in the same package. That could have felt easier uh, at some point, right? Uh, but on the other hand, that also takes away limitations. So we try to make Serverpod as easy to use as possible, while still making sure we don't impose any limitations on how you can use Serverpod. So you should be able to use Serverpod with your Flutter app, with your or multiple Flutter apps, or um, also maybe clients in different languages eventually. So that's why we opted for using these YAML files. So the models aren't bound necessarily to Dart, but we can add a client for JavaScript if you maybe have a web page where you want to access the same models. We can do that. So it's always a balance of having that flexibility, and like we could have used, I'm sure, made a few things simpler, but I would also have made them less flexible. So there's a balance, but we really try to, I mean, one of the priorities, we also worked a lot on the documentation to make it easier and more accessible, getting those first tutorials very easy to follow. So maybe give it another chance, is my advice.
Yes. Okay, that's great. Then let's continue with the next question. Yeah, you have a Serverpod roadmap. I saw it also before on the documentation, but which kind of feature you are most excited about in the Serverpod roadmap that is still coming?
All right, so we have another feature that is almost done. We discovered some issues that we need to fix before we can release it, but that is a inheritance in the models. I think that will be super useful for instance, real-time communication, because that means that you can still have typed communication, but can have a group of subclasses that you can pass through a typed interface. Right now in the streams, you can send models, but if you send different types of models, it's just like a dynamic type. It would be really nice to be able to provide more strict types there. So that's one thing I'm really excited about getting in there. We're also building a replacement. Basically, we're rewriting shelf. We call that relic. So there are some issues in Dart shelf. I think it's mostly because shelf was written a long time ago, and Dart as a language has evolved since then. It's also based on some other framework, I think, because it uses a lot of dynamic types for input parameters, which is just not good practice in a framework. So we're making sure everything is typed. We're moving everything to use uint 8 list instead of list int, which also much more efficient internally in the server. And we're adding support for like all the headers you have in HTML, so those come across in a type parsed way. So that will be a sort of it's like Shelf 2.0. We'll be happy to make that a pull request and call it Shelf 2 if the Dart Google team happy with that. But that'll be sort of the foundation for Serverpod, but also allow us to provide a really solid web server, because sometimes you both want to have all the niceness of the Serverpod API, but you want to use a web server for serving web pages. So for instance, I worked on a news app before, and there you have the news app, but you also need to be able to send someone a link with a one of the news articles, and that you probably don't want to send a link to an app that they have to install, but just a web page. Being able to serve that through the same system and use the same code to fetch all information in that news article is really, really convenient. So that's also something I'm really excited to get done and get out there and have, really, really polished. We have a solution for it now, but we're making it much, much better.
Okay, that's great. That's really great. Yeah, so maybe there's some more questions. Just have a look. You can also ask still more questions and we go over them. So, like one person mentioned, please do mention Jasper, as that was the missing part.
Yeah, Jasper. So you can integrate Serverpod with Jasper, and Jasper is basically a way of rendering your web pages, either server side or I think you can do some client side together with it, and that gives all the benefits you have in Serverpod with access to database, caching, all that stuff. So it's a really good mix, and that will also work with the new version of our web server. So it's just like a seamless integration. So you can plug in any system that you want.
Yes. Then there's another question. Can Serverpod be integrated with different platforms, for example, native Android, web, etc.? And can it be built large-scale applications using Serverpod?
So yes, Serverpod can scale to any size, so that's really not a problem. Typically, your bottleneck will be your database. So that's where things like caching come in and handling more as much as you can on the server rather than in the database. But yeah, you can also scale the database with something like AlloyDB, or it works with Spanner. So that will basically scale to any size. YouTube is built on Spanner, and that's Postgres compatible. We use Postgres for the database, so that's a reason we choose Postgres, because it's like highly scalable. And then was also the question of native Android and web. Yes, so Serverpod just generates a REST API that is very well formed, so you can access that directly if you need to. Also use like standard forms of authentication and all that. So it's a clean package, if you will, in that respect. But that being said, we're planning on adding code generation for more languages than Dart. So JavaScript will be the first one, but we want to add Kotlin, Swift, probably, maybe some others too.
Okay, that's great that you support more. Yeah, I think here we go. Yeah, I think we are through the question and answers, or I didn't see anything more that is not to talk about. At the very end, do you have like any other things that you want to mention and tell about Serverpod to the people? What is maybe something that you're really important and you want to share with the people right now?
I'm not sure I have anything else in particular, but just give it a shot and try it out, and feel free to give us feedback. We read everything we get on GitHub or in social media, and try to make as much of the things that people want possible. Yeah, and yeah, thanks for having me on your show. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you as well for being part of this live stream and for showing us how to use Serverpod. And of course, check it out, try it out, how to use Serverpod. And thank you very much for being part of this live stream.
Thank you.
Thank you.